The next subject is finance mechanisms for conservation of the world's forests. Moderator Sally Ranney.
Natural Resource Director under two governors for Colorado, Governor Lamb and Governor Ritter. And Obama appointed him as Undersecretary of Agriculture, and he was responsible for the entire Forest Service and the National Conservation Soils Organization. So I wanted to ask him about his perceptions and his experience, both here in Colorado and managing the Forest Service, and what some of the mechanisms were for preservation and conservation.
Thank you, Sally. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and kudos to you and Chip for putting on an incredible conference. I feel like I've been drinking from a fire hydrant all day. And so I would like to focus principally on what is happening with our forests in the United States. And I know some of the other panelists are going to talk about internationally what is happening. I think it's important to give you a snapshot of what is in fact happening to our national forest as a result of climate change and past management of our forests. We have roughly 200 million acres of national forest in America. And of the 200 million acres, I would say approximately 80 million are stressed. And they're stressed because they are old, they're monolithic, they're single-aged, they're very susceptible to disease. I think you're all familiar with the bark beetle epidemic, which has taken out about 40 million acres of forest in the US. And they're very susceptible to catastrophic wildfire. We are seeing wildfires today that we have never seen before. In early 2000, you would rarely see more than 5 million acres of forest going up in flames. Today, we are routinely at 9 to 10 million acres of forest going up every year. And the fire season is being extended by 60 to 75 days each year as a result of what has been happening. So we have some real challenges ahead of us with respect to fire. And the interesting thing is that these forests that I'm talking about are really not performing the functions that forests perform in terms of sequestering carbon, storing water, dealing with recreation, providing habitat for wildlife, and threatened and endangered species. So these are challenge forests, and the Forest Service has made a real effort to try to go out and to restore forests back to a state of resiliency where they can perform these functions that we've been talking about. But doing that costs an enormous amount of money. And interestingly, during the Obama years, the budget of the Forest Service was pretty flat. In the Trump years, we'll see what happens, but I predict it's going to go down substantially. But we had a complication of spending so much of the budget fighting forest fires. And the reality is that these forest fires have consumed recently something like 56% of the Forest Service's budget, which is just enormous. And you compare that to 20 years ago when only 14% of the budget went for fighting forest fires. So the question is, how do you raise money to preserve and protect forest and to bring them back to a state of resiliency? And we really struggled with how to do this. And you know, it would be great if we had a carbon tax. It would be great if there was a regulatory cap and trade program. But that wasn't going to happen. Congress simply wasn't going to go in that direction. So we have been, and I say we, I'm no longer with the Forest Service, but we were reaching out to try to figure out who are the beneficiaries of these forests. And could we get the beneficiaries of these forests to step to the table and to make some significant contributions to the cost of reclaiming these forests? And we went first, interestingly, to these water districts in the United States. The Denver Water Board is a perfect example. Denver went through 2 catastrophic forest fires, and the result was after the fires there were floods. And sedimentation and debris just absolutely choked their reservoirs. And it cost them tens of millions of dollars to dredge these reservoirs. So we went to Denver and said, look, would you partner with us in doing a certain amount of restoration work in your watershed? And they said, well, wait a minute, you know, you're the United States government. These are national forests. Why should we contribute to this? Well, the answer was because the federal government alone could not do the job. So Denver stepped forward, and they have made substantial contribution to a joint public-private effort. And on the private side, this has been funded by the ratepayers of Denver. Now, the same thing could happen with the utilities. The utilities have transmission lines across the forest. They're very worried about these utility lines surviving catastrophic fires. So we went to the utilities and said, would you be willing to contribute to do forest restoration work to protect your utility lines? And Jeff, I don't know if Jeff is still here with the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. That was a question. Should the ratepayers pay the U.S. Forest Service to protect transmission lines? The ski areas in Colorado, they had a program where when you got your lift ticket, you could pay an extra $1 or $1 would be taken out of the cost of the lift ticket to start to go into a fund to protect forest around ski resorts. The reinsurance industry spends billions of dollars every year dealing with paying off claims for catastrophic fire. Would they be willing at the front end rather than the tail end to think about helping to restore forest? So I could go down the list of potential beneficiaries, but we have really learned that in many ways, absent regulation and absent tax policy, you have to look to the beneficiaries of these forests to try to hope that they will join you in doing something. And it's interesting, internationally, I'm with an organization called Forest Trends now. They do terrific work around the world coming up with new models for financing of forest preservation. Recently in Peru, the national government and the city of Lima, they are doing essentially what the Denver Water Board is doing by taxing their residents through fees on their water bills to pay for good work that's occurring in the Andes, the headwaters of Lima's water system. So let me stop there, and I'll be happy to come back to responding.
Yes, because I have a couple questions. So our next panelist is Rod Richardson, and he is the president of the Grace Richardson Foundation. And this foundation has quite a long history of being involved in pioneering new market policy and regulation. And one of the things that they've just recently done, and last year we gave Rod the platform here at our day to announce the clean tax cut proposals that he's been dealing with. Since that, there's been, what, 9 or 11 charrettes?
Well, it depends what you call a charrette, of course. But there have been at least 8 that are officially charrettes, I guess, and a couple of others that are more extended conversations.
Okay, great. So, and these were conducted in different sectors. So there was oil and gas charrette, there was agriculture charrette, and there was a forestry charrette as well. And so, Rod, if you'd tell us a little bit about CTC and then focus in on what came out of the forest and agriculture.
Sure.
Charrettes.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. The Nature Conservancy co-hosted the Agriculture and Forestry Charrette along with the Rodale Institute, Climate Advisors, and Grace Richardson Fund a couple of months ago in Washington, D.C. It produced a couple of really interesting concepts. Of course, you know, one of the areas where there's actually a pre-existing example of the clean tax cut concept is in conservation, where there's such a thing as a conservation easement, a charitable deduction for a conservation easement. So the idea of taxing good things less is baked into that idea right there. And there were, a couple of ideas that were pretty interesting regarding forestry. I don't know I'll deal with forestry more than agriculture because that's more on here. But one was to take conservation, lands that are in conservation easement, sales of conservation easements, and make them capital gains tax-free. So that if you're selling a conservation easement, there's no capital gains on that sale. And there's no sale if you're selling lands that are in conservation easement, so that it passes along. Makes it more advantageous to the owners to have a conservation easement. With respect to forestry, one of the interesting ideas was to have a reduced tax rate on sales of certified forest products. So any products made with certified forest wood would be taxed much less, whatever that would be, half tax perhaps. And that would encourage more use of certified wood as opposed to wood that is not certified and perhaps harvested unsustainably. There were a variety of other concepts as well for agriculture, and you can read the report on the cleantaxcuts.org if you'd like to go into it in more detail. I did want to say that Brett had been very interested about doing a charrette on, expanding this to rainforests. And of course, that's a whole other area with multi-jurisdictional problems. And we would be very interested in having that conversation, but it does present other issues. It came to my attention that, it'll have to extend beyond clean tax cuts, because clean tax cuts can really motivate private owners of land to preserve and conserve their land better. And the conservation easements show that concept works. But it's a tough concept to apply internationally because in many, many situations, the land tenure is very, very vague in these countries that have ownership of the rainforest. In some countries, there is no private property ownership of the rainforest that's recognized. You could certainly try to incentivize a corporation to buy land in conservation easement in a rainforest, which seems like a great idea, except that it would be illegal for them to buy the land in the rainforest, and there's no clear title anyway. So, many of the, Brett has made me aware that, some of the groups that are doing RED financing are trying to combine that with secure land tenure, secure title for indigenous populations, because those private property rights, those rights for those tribes, help to secure the land. I think that a conversation on rainforests has got to include, a discussion of what it's going to take to make land tenure or property rights in the rainforest more secure, so that these mechanisms would work better. With that, I'll say that's enough. But let me just add that the Clean Tax Cut charrette process is open to involvement. So if anybody would like to get involved in this discussion or others, please let us know, because more minds bring better ideas and ultimately better solutions.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And one of the things that is really interesting about what Rod is doing is that there has been a lot of bipartisan interest in this. So it may be down the road one of the things where Republicans and Democrats might be able to agree upon. Yeah, and good luck. Our next panelist is Brett Byers, and he's a very creative fellow. He is a managing director of Partner Ventures, where he's been for about a decade, and has invested in clean tech, both ChangePoint and DIRT. And he has started something called the 1 Million Acre Pledge, which is a really creative approach to looking at primarily rainforests and how to protect large landscape forests. So Brett, would you tell us more about how did you come up with this idea, and what are you doing now, and how far have you advanced?
Great. Well, thank you. So my interest, I really woke up to, and I apologize for taking so long, but I woke up to climate change maybe being a really big threat to life on Earth, including to us humans, a couple of years ago. And I also was interested in conservation then, and spent some time learning about the role of forest, particularly tropical forest, can have in relation to climate change. And because of the love of that area and my interest in climate change, and the fact that I didn't think there was quite enough attention on that area, I decided to focus on that area. And I took a pledge to myself that I would finance charitable efforts to conserve 1 million acres of tropical rainforest. Now, you shouldn't clap too loudly, because I'm definitely not the first person to do anything like this. There are people that have done things that are much more famous than I before me, including Chris and Doug Tompkins, who are part of the 1 Million Acre Pledge, who famously bought 2 million acres in Patagonia, and it's now been converted into national parks. And there are obviously others. Ted Turner has famously bought 2 million acres here in the US and really brought bison back to the US and brought grasslands and natural landscapes back to these ranch areas. So there are plenty of people that have done this at scale, and in fact, those two sets of folks did it the expensive way, which is actually buying the land. Ted did a really expensive way. He bought expensive land here in the US. So I did it the cheap way, which is to support charitable efforts, really to protect publicly owned lands. So, and I then started something called the 1 Million Acre Pledge to encourage other people to do the same thing. And there's about a half a dozen 1 Million Acre Pledges now. My goal is to have hundreds, and you can imagine that if you actually had hundreds of people who financed efforts to preserve 1 million acres, that actually adds up to quite a bit. And the reason that I'm interested in forests is that the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents that are stored as carbon in forests, this includes the carbon in the soil just below the forest, actually rivals the amount of carbon that is stored in the proven fossil fuel reserves in the world. And of course, we've heard that you cannot afford to burn perhaps even 20% of those proven reserves of fossil fuels. Likewise, you can't afford to destroy a large portion of our remaining forests. So there are others that have recognized the importance of forests. For example, you all may know about Paul Hawkins' book, Project Drawdown, and he has number 5 is tropical forest conservation and restoration as a potential solution to climate change. Obviously, it's not the solution. It's really just one critical element. And it's actually very hard to stay below 2 degrees warming if all of the remaining forests in the world were destroyed, or even a significant portion of them. So another reason I focus on it is you may know that tropical rainforest is considered maybe 10% of the problem in terms of CO2 emissions, in terms of destruction of rainforest. But it actually can be much more of the solution, and the reason being is there are hundreds of millions of acres of degraded rainforest, and if you just let that regrow naturally, it would suck up huge amount of carbon dioxide, such that you actually could offset in the next few decades, up to 30% of the current fossil fuel emissions. So this could really have a big impact in the near term.
That's great. Excuse me. that is a really good way to get people to know about those who have done large properties and brought them back to their original ecological function. And at the same time, focusing on rainforests, I think, is really, really important, and Rod hit on it a little bit, is that the treaties that have been violated of indigenous people, approximately 80% of land-based biodiversity is in those great forests. So protecting those through whatever means, creative means, and financing that is really valuable, really important. The other thing is focusing on Brazil, because they just cut their environmental budget by half. So the enforcement in Brazil on logging has just rapidly gone down. May even disappear. We don't know yet. This just happened a few weeks ago. So Sally Cox is founder and president of the Bonobo Conservation Initiative, and she is the Jane Goodall of bonobos, as Jane is to chimpanzees. And she's called in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, she's called Mama Bonobo. And she works with the DRC government. She works with local villages. She has started a technical college on sustainability for local villages. So she works very closely. There's a peace reserve. She has been involved with protecting some of the largest contiguous pieces of the Congo forest, and one is actually the largest contiguous piece protected in the world of rainforest. So Sally, tell us a little bit about BCI and some of the financing mechanisms. I know you've been involved with the Development Bank, you've been involved with partnerships with other organizations. Why don't you share with us how you're approaching your work?
Sure. Thank you very much. Well, I like being on this panel among this group. I'm the only one that needs to be the recipient of finance mechanisms. So it's of keen interest to me. So what does saving bonobos, great ape, related to humans, have to do with preserving rainforest? And, I didn't think about that when I got into this. I was just trying to help save a species. And we began with the local people, the indigenous people who share the habitat with bonobos. And by developing a vision with them of a sustainable model for conservation and community development that benefits people and the biodiversity of the rainforest, it has led us to protecting almost 9 million acres of rainforest legally in 2 nature reserves in the Congo. And our model is actually self-replicating and going viral on its own. So we have, right now, I'm partnering with Brett on the Million Acre Pledge. We have 2 million more acres of rainforest just waiting to be protected, and really the only block at this point is money. So, the traditional forms of financing conservation are philanthropy, individual donors, grants, foundations, et cetera. And most of our funds have come through those sources. Now there are much greater opportunities for payment for ecosystem services, because the rainforest, not only sequesters billions of tons of carbon and provides oxygen and water and many things we need, medicines. So now there are new mechanisms to pay for those services. One of them is called REDD, Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation. And it is a carbon credit scheme that has taken a long time to really work. So we're involved with that, but it's now 2017. We got the first contract in the DRC for REDD in 2009. and we have yet to sell a carbon credit. So it's got a lot of hope, and I know that Forest Trends, your work, you're involved with this as well. But, you know, and that too will generate a market-driven mechanism. Because the thing is, as Rod knows very well, the only way to make a sustainable solution is that you've got to have some economically generating, market-driven solutions. And so that's what we've been trying to do. And part of the puzzle also, and what we're working with the local communities on doing, is to develop income-generating projects. Agriculture is hugely important. I'm really glad you had a charrette about that, and I hope you take that international as well. You know, the population of the earth is growing, and Africa is going to be our breadbasket, or one of the most important. And agriculture is also the thing that produces the most impact on the forest. So by developing climate-smart agriculture and making sure that those opportunities are delivered to the communities that are invested in conservation of their forest, you've got a viable solution where, because the people, you know, the way that our peace forest is self-replicating is because we developed it with the indigenous people. We did not go in with a top-down approach, and we solved the problem together, and we helped to meet some of their needs. And it's only been on a small scale so far, but, you know, for example, their staple crop, cassava, had a disease. So we partnered with an agriculture group, brought in disease-resistant cassava, trained the people how to replicate it. It reduced impact on the forest by producing greater yields on less land, improved their food security, and it was something they could sell. And so they replicated and went village to village to village. And that one project alone, I think, has had more to do with why other communities want to join the Peace Forest than many others. We founded a technical college, which is also a piece of the puzzle, because investment also has to support these local institutions and governance systems. You know, I think my other concern about the funding that is available, there's a big green climate fund that is going to produce impact investing for things like these market-driven solutions, as well as conservation, straight-up conservation. But a lot of the aid, you know, gets stuck and never reaches the ground. And so, you know, just by way of example, this morning I woke up to a text. One of the former nurses at the health clinic that we founded in the Kokolo Cree Reserve became inspired to go back to his own community, which has bonobos, and he wrote up statutes and founded his own community association, got the whole community behind protecting bonobos. And he sent me a text this morning saying, "Mama bonobo, to komi na mbula mi bale, to kobana mosala tango nini." That means it's been 2 years. When are you coming? When are we going to start the work? And that is my biggest problem, is we don't have the funding. We've got more rainforest to protect. 2 million acres right now with all the statutes and the legalities pretty much done, and then now this one and another new site spawning off. And you just don't get better than that in conservation. You know, it's, you hear people moaning and groaning about how difficult it is to work in the Congo. But our problem is we just don't, you know, we've actually hit on a model that has got the promise of being truly sustainable and, you know, has really the local and national buy-in, but we just need funds.
Yeah, it's an amazing dedication that Sally has shown over the years to her work, and often at great odds. So I have loads of questions, but I want to open it up. We have a little bit of time left for questions from the audience of any one of the panelists. So who has questions? Tara. Microphone? Right there. Right there.
Thank you so much. And Sally, I think you need a few really great fundraisers. And I know I and others could volunteer their time and services to do that. Honestly, I think what we're talking about when we all get together and do this, really amazing things happen. What's that, charrettes? Let's do a charrette. And I'm serious. But the question I have is, according to the Savory Institute, the Great Plains, having been wiped out of bison in 50 years, can actually have the same effect that the rainforest has for reducing carbon by being repopulated with millions of bison. And so I'm really, for any panel member, I'm wondering if it's right in our backyard, and has anybody really explored that, the viability of restoring the Great Plains and working deeply with the indigenous people and having those same, 1 million acres purchased by people in the United States or people, of the world. So I'm just curious about that. And maybe, Sally, you have the answer.
What I can say is that a few years ago there was a proposal called the Buffalo Commons. And it was started by a group of environmentalists, conservationists, and they linked up with the Land Institute, Wes Jackson. And one of the proposals, I don't know how many of you know Wes, but he's brilliant and he's a wild card, and he has done some amazing things with native grasses and developing, bringing back native grasses that have very high protein content. And during the Buffalo Commons, one of his ideas was fence in the communities on the plains, fence in the people, and let the buffalo roam. I kind of like that, actually. And so originally there were 60 million bison estimated in the Great Plains. We shot them down, both to take away the food source of the Indians and basically just a lot of slaughter, down to 200 animals. 200 animals. So they were more lucky than the passenger pigeon that I talked about earlier. And now there are about 300,000 in the United States, and about, I'm going to say, not quite 100,000 in Canada. And it's taken all this time, to bring them back. So to go to your question, in order to do that, bison move, and their hoof action with their feces is what gets the grasses going, and also bison move. They don't sit like cattle. They don't sit in the riparian areas and eat and eat and eat. They move, 5-10 miles a day. So one of the reasons they did that is because they had predators on the plains. And those predators are gone. Grizzly were once on the plains. Wolf was once on the plains. So it's not just bringing the bison back. It's a whole ecosystem restoration conversation. So,
Could I just add very briefly, I've done a little bit of work with the National Bison Association, and I think there are actually about 500,000 bison today in the U.S., but the goal is to raise that to 1 million, and they will have a Million Bison campaign announced, I think, fairly soon. But your point is well taken. It's interesting how there's conflict between cattlemen and the bison groups over, whether one is hurting the land more than the other. But I think your point is a really good one, that there are ways to bring this back. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, an agency that I have the privilege of overseeing, they provide a lot of technical assistance to landowners on conservation-related issues. And they are a perfect agency to work on this type of an issue.
another question? Oh, one more, just one more. Hurry, hurry, hurry. The clock is.
So this is a difficult question. It's a kind of a paradigm question, and I don't really expect anybody to answer it right now. But this is a chronic nonprofit question. Sally, you really bring it up for me big time. And here we are working for almost nothing, 7 days a week, hours a day, and we also have to fundraise? That is the craziest, dumbest model for fixing the world that one could ever think of.
So
And
question?
So the question is, how do we change that model? Hunter was talking about the public, the funding, the private funding of projects. And I said, well, what about a private funded project that is today's version of the Civilian Conservation Corps? People could make money on that, and workers could get paid well, and we could do our nonprofit work out of that. But we have to make a change. I mean, we are hobbling around on one leg trying to run these nonprofits, and it drives us nuts.
We've got, okay, a couple people who might want to address that. Brett?
Yeah, I'm obviously trying to help with the Million Acre Pledge. I only have half a dozen pledgers. I'm hoping to have so many that I'll be able to help you all. But Sally touched upon one mechanism, and as did Harris, which is basically, if you value the ecosystem services and you actually have the people who benefit from those services pay for those services, the amount of funding is tremendous. So the value, for example, of the world's forests to the world is measured in the trillions of dollars when you consider the ecosystem services. And there are efforts to make this monetizable. So right now, REDD is an example of that. It's a payment for the service of carbon sequestration, and Sally mentioned that. Right now, it's totally voluntary. There's about $1 billion a year going into it, and it's mostly contributed by Norway, Germany, and the UK, although the US actually contributes a couple $100 million a year as well. There's also voluntary REDD purchases by corporations such as Disney, Barclays Bank, some of the oil companies as well. But it's again, very small. I can tell you the need in terms of how much you need to save the world's forests is tens of billions of dollars a year. And the value to the world of saving the world's forest is far in excess of that when you look at the social cost of carbon sequestration alone, not even considering the other ecosystem services such as watershed services. So we don't yet have the magic bullet there. There's been a tremendous amount of development of the process and the system to do that. There is potentially one offset that would come from the international aviation sector. So there is a plan that has been adopted by the International Civil Aviation Organization that caps CO2 emissions from international aviation in the year 2020. And after that, there's going to have to be some sort of offset or some mechanism. And it's not been defined yet. It hasn't been agreed to. But it could be, for example, REDD credits, and that could provide billions of dollars for rainforest restoration or conservation.
So it comes,
Sorry.
What are the services worth that prevent this from becoming a dead planet? How much business can you do on a dead planet? How much restoration can you do on a dead planet? That is the paradigm that we have to shift to, otherwise we'll just be treading water.
It comes down to values. What do we value? What is our priority? I touched on it in my presentation. The shift, a deep, deep root cause shift. Otherwise, we'll be doing all these things and it'll just be wrapped in a different package, but we'll be making the same kinds of decisions and using resources. using them really, really, really fast. So, you know, that's a quick answer to that, and we have to end it. Have to end it. I'm in big trouble here. Thank you.